the channel for English. If you're using a computer, click on Interpretation once interpretation has been enabled. Or if you're connected by the Zoom app on your phone, click on the 3 dots. Again, once interpretation has been enabled. Then follow the
Uh-oh, Lars, we lost your audio.
I think because you enabled the interpretation, they went to the thing.
Interpretation is now enabled. We will pass it to you.
Dr. Bullock, I believe that we can no longer hear Lars because his accounts are both in the interpretation section. But for those of you that need interpretation, the instructions are in the chat, as well as it is available as the icon on the bottom of your screen. And do we want to go ahead and get started?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Okay, so as folks continue to be admitted, I thank you so much for your patience this evening. Technologies can sometimes get away from us, but we getting all situated. And again, if you know anybody that was trying to get into the Zoom room but couldn't before, please make sure that they get that link. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our Critical Race Theory Town Hall discussion. I am Brittany Del Rosario, my pronouns are she, they, and I'm the Children and Families Program Coordinator with We Are. Please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself and to tell us where you're joining us from this evening. We Are stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education and is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides anti-racism training for children, families, and educators. We use a 3-pronged approach to dismantle systemic racism in education by offering summer camps for children in rising 1st through 5th grade, professional development for educators, and workshops for parents and families. Our purpose for this evening is to bring our state and local leaders together to talk about the attacks against CRT in education. We want to cover the recent uptick in violence against school boards locally and throughout the country. And our goal is to start creating a more unified public response to this anti-truth-telling and anti-democracy movement. At We Are, we know that Durham can be a leader in this movement. And thank you to those of you that are letting us know where you're coming from. Before we begin, we would like to invite all of you to join us in a native land acknowledgement. In a moment, one of my colleagues will drop a link into the chat and our respective streaming sites. Before we begin any work this evening, we must bring attention to the fact that we're living and learning on stolen land. I invite you to head to the website, insert your location, and copy and paste the native tribes that once cared for the land you're currently on. To name Oh, sorry, I'm going too fast. My apologies. So let me start this section again because it is important. Before we begin, we would like to invite all of you to join us in a native land acknowledgement. In a moment, one of my colleagues will drop a link, and I believe that link is already there. Thank you, Dr. Davis, into the chat and on our respective streaming sites. Before we begin any work this evening, we must bring attention to the fact that we are living and learning on stolen land. I invite you to head to the website, insert your location, and copy and paste the native tribes that once cared for the land you are currently on. To name those tribes is to keep them alive and in the present. We must do everything we can to ensure that their history and their current existence isn't erased. A couple of moments here. If we wouldn't mind dropping that link again. Thank you, Dr. Davis. All right. So please continue to add those Native tribe names to the chat. Also, if you didn't get a chance to, let us know where you're zooming in from. And please feel free to continue to utilize the chat this evening to make comments or ask questions. To start off our discussion, I'd like to pass the mic to We Are's lead curator, Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock, for more context on this evening's topic. Dr. Bullock.
Yes, thank you so much, Brittany, for doing that. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock. I am the co-founder and lead curator at We Are. I'm also a critical race scholar, and I do critical whiteness studies specifically, and I study white children's racial identity construction. And so I am going to do a quick PowerPoint with you to kind of set the context and provide high-level overview of what we're doing here this evening. Okay, so for one, we're here because we're talking about CRT, right? CRT in the community. And so I wanted to share this thread with you all because in the media, we've seen quite a few comments about CRT, a lot of pushback against CRT, that we don't want to have these conversations. And there's been a lot of parental concern, community concern, and political concern. And so this is a meme that a thread on Twitter that I wanted to share to start this conversation, because there's been a lot of talk about CRT in schools. And so I pulled this from Twitter because I thought it was important to help ground our conversation. So Jeff Eaton writes, "My wife works at our local Catholic school, was asked by a parent if the school intended to teach critical race theory. She replied, 'Explain to me what it is, and I'll tell you if we teach it.' The parent had no reply." And that's pretty much been the gist of the conversation that we have seen. There have been people talking about CRTs in schools, but they don't really know what CRT is. If you talk to your average educator, they didn't know what CRT was either, because most educators are not teaching it. This is a theory that's rooted at the collegiate level. So, but I just wanted to just high level, what are some people saying? People are saying now they're teaching racism in public schools. CRT sucks, and so does the people who teach it. That would include us over here at We Are. Keep CRT out of taxpayer funded schools. It has no business being taught in public schools. We have people saying this is not education, it's corruption. And so hearing all of this narratives makes you think, like, what in the world is CRT? And it would make you feel like, no, we don't want this in our schools. We don't want critical race theory in our schools if this is the only narrative. However, what is CRT really? Right? So I want to just put that out. It's a lot of fear mongering, a lot of gaslighting around CRT and the pushback against it in schools and in communities. I want to say that many people don't even know what it is. And even the politicians who are using it, they don't actually know what it is either. What is it really? CRT posits that race is socially constructed and it's not biological. The race is socially constructed, it is not biological. This is a fact. That racism is systemic and endemic, meaning it is always going to be a part of it is a part of our American society, and it will always be a part of it. One of the things that CRT helps us to do is to move away from individual meanness and biases and bigotry to look at systems. It removes you from that individual shame to look at this is how systems are working together. Laws and policies have come together historically and create a pattern of racial oppression. This is true. And what CRT asks us to do is to don't think about the individual racism that's happening among people, zoom out and look at laws and policies that are contributing to the harm. CRT talks about how laws were based on race to create racial discrimination, and this has happened historically. For example, CRT asks us to look at and analyze, for example, redlining. Redlining was law. People were legally allowed to put blocks around Black neighborhoods, to underfund them, to not have loans there, and which resulted in generational wealth for people who identified as white as they were buying their homes. That was law. CRT says, let's name that. CRT says, let's name that Jim Crow was real, that it was legal. This was legal segregation based on race. There's an impact to that. And then it talks about looking at the criminal justice system, for example, and looking at the disparities in the number of African-American men sent to prison in comparison to white men sent to prison. And it says you can't look at these individually. If we zoom out and look at these, and this is just 3 examples, that there are patterns, that there's an impact on people based on race, that there are systems based on race that were used to elevate those who identify as white and to oppress those who do not, primarily those people of color, people of the global majority, and Black people specifically. And CRT says, let's look at that. In academic speak, these are the tenets of the critical race theory framework. Race and racism should be centralized in all studies. Dominant perspectives should be challenged through the telling of counter narratives. It's a social justice agenda must be present in our analysis. The experiential knowledge of people of color, they mattered, and they should be moved from the margin to the center. And it helps us to understand that the world is multidimensional and our oppression intersects, right? So CRT started in critical legal studies, and scholars such as Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw said, hey, we can't just look at these laws and not pay attention to how these laws impact race and racial dynamics in our country. And it's rooted in truth-telling and in facts, and looking at how the multiplicative effect of all of these laws and policies contribute to social inequality, discrimination that we experience and see today. So in our country right now, CRT is a hot button issue. We've had a lot of folks calling and asking us about this. How are we doing this conversation? What it's about? What are we doing? And some people being nervous around it. On the one hand, as I said before, that many of the politicians and even the parents who are pushing back on CRT being taught in schools, they don't actually know what CRT is. We want to say it's gaslighting. We believe that it is gaslighting. There's other things that we need to be focused on. And again, this has become like the boogeyman, right? The new thing to blame in education. I also want to say that while this is gaslighting, while a lot of people don't know what they're talking about when they use this language of CRT and confusing it with anti-racism and confusing it with talking about race and racism and confusing it with history, there are very real impacts to this rise and uptick. So for example, locally here, we had some GOP leaders who denounced critical race theory resolution. They named Durham City Council for having a racial equity task force that talked about the need and importance of focusing on a systemic understanding of race and racism in schools. A part of that, our school board was also named, the Durham Public School Board was also named and criticized because we now have a racial equity policy. Also locally in the Orange County School Board had to meet virtually after the Proud Boys showed up at their school board meeting. Not only did they show up at the school board meeting, they also showed up at the football game and were harassing children and families who came to watch football. So again, while this is gaslighting, there are very real consequences to this. Also, We Ours was named by Phil Berger. He posted on Facebook because WRAL did a story about the work that we're doing in our anti-racism summer camps. And within the thread, he used images of the children in our camp, and or I should say his Facebook account. And then was just a thread of just hateful comments underneath it. Actually, many of those comments I showed you earlier come from this actual post. Then if we zoom out a little bit, we have book banning. We have censorship happening. And not just any books, books that talk specifically about history, race, racism, books that talk about, the history of indigenous people, books that talk about, such as, what's Ibram Kennedy's book is escaping me, How to Be an Anti-Racist Educator, books by Maya Angelou, and just books that are rooted in talking about Black and brown people and our very lived real experiences. These books are being banned. And a part of that is not just about banning truth and what's happening, it's also contributing to this rise of this movement that is rooted in white supremacy. And then even in Texas, there was a bill banning and limiting teachers' ability to talk about race and critical race theory in schools. And not only that, there's this conversation of we need to teach both sides of the Holocaust. What are those two sides? We're not trying to scare people, but we do want to create a sense of urgency around what is happening here in these conversations, and the pushback, because it's not just about books, it's not about CRT. What's happening here is white supremacy. White supremacy is the real threat. There is a rise in fascism. There's a rise in people who are rooted in anti-democracy, anti-public education. And we as a community are in this space here to talk about that, to talk about how can we as a community, if we believe in freedom and justice and truth-telling, our voices need to be heard, and we need to be just as organized as these voices who are anti-democracy, anti-truth-telling. And so before we transition into our panel, I just want to put this on you all that today it's CRT, tomorrow what's it going to be tomorrow? And if we don't have some pushback in this public rhetoric, then this anti-CRT, anti-truth-telling movement will win. And so I just want to ask you all, which side of history are you on? Which side of history do you want to be on in this movement? And so I thank you all for being here. I'm going to pass it back to our host, who's going to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Bullock, for that context for critical race theory. Before we move into our panel, I'd like to take a moment to introduce each of our invited guests who knew that tonight's discussion was of the utmost importance and that their attendance is part of the vital process to move us forward as a community. Joining us this evening is North Carolina Senator Natalie Murdoch, Durham County Commissioner Wendy Jacobs, and Durham City Council Member Javiera Caballero, as well as our panelists for this evening, Durham Public Schools Board Member Javonia Lewis, Durham Public Schools Board Member Alexandra Valladares, North Carolina Public School Educator Rodney Pierce, and Durham Association of Educators President Michelle Burton, and North Carolina House Representative Zach Hawkins. Thank you all for being here with us this evening. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our questions. Our aim is to zoom into our local context first, and then we'll zoom out to a broader view from the state and national perspective. That being said, Rodney Pierce, this first question is for you. As an educator, can you tell us about the pushback you have received in talking about the history of race and racism in your curriculum?
Yes, ma'am. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for having me again, and thank you for this important conversation. A lot can be said about that in terms of my personal experience. I've received phone calls, not necessarily phone calls from parents. I've received emails from parents. I've received emails from administrators who've received emails or phone calls from parents. I have also sort of been subject to what some might call COINTELPRO 2.0, where you have people, I don't know if they would be students or colleagues, but you have people in your school building who, if you chastise a student in the hallway, and rightfully so, because they're either being disrespectful, they're breaking a school rule, and you approach them and, the conversation might get a little heated because the student wants to take a certain tone of voice with you or wants to appear that, they want to try to physically intimidate you or let you know, I'm not afraid of you, and you're sitting there trying to make your point, you'll be recorded. Pictures will be taken. They will record what you say in your classroom when you're teaching. So it's like it's like you're under surveillance to an extent, and whatever can possibly be used against you to make you look like you're not doing your job, or that you're doing your job in a way that feeds into this new political narrative that we have going on surrounding critical race theory, then that will be used against you to possibly affect your employment status. And what I've received, I know, pales in comparison to what other colleagues around the state or around this country have been subject to. But those are just some of the things that I have experienced.
Well, thank you for your candid response, Rodney. That is, yes, it's one of those things where you need to definitely be aware of your surroundings, even as a teacher, and think about how these things can impact not only yourself, but your colleagues, and again, like you said, what other things your colleagues might be experiencing as well. So thank you for that candid response. Our next question is for our school board members, Alexandra Valladares and Giovanni Lewis. So Durham Public Schools has been critiqued several times by state level officials, including Lieutenant Governor Robinson and Senate Leader Phil Berger. What are your thoughts surrounding the attacks on our school board and school boards across the state?
Thank you for that question, Brittany. First, we don't teach critical race theory in Durham Public Schools or any K-12 public school that I'm aware of, as Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock began in her discussion. Our educators teach math, science, reading, writing, history, arts, music. These attacks are a distraction from teaching the full history without indoctrination, but allowing for critical thinking for our students. It is misleading to suggest our board resolution was pushing our state to include CRT in North Carolina education. That's just not true. If you read the resolution our Board of Education passed, it calls out that the CRT bill would effectively restrict and prohibit honest conversation about race, conflicting with existing state and local education standards, and infringing on free speech and free speech rights of our students, educators, and staff. In fact, the truth is, the resolution we passed advocates for urging members of the North Carolina General Assembly to focus on developing a robust public education budget with an equity toolkit that fully supports students in North Carolina, that fully funds the Leandro mandate, that supports our most vulnerable students. Our children are suffering in schools that cannot provide and meet their basic needs without physical, emotional, and learning differences, economic disadvantages, racial discrimination, living in rural districts, learning English without access to early childhood education. Those are the things that's not being funded. There's an $8 billion surplus that's needed to get the schools that we deserve. And instead of talking about the needs of children, there's this false narrative about CRT. And that's just not the case. We are not teaching CRT in our schools. We need to talk about underfunding of public schools and focus on that. Let's talk about how we have overfunded independent schools without public oversight through public vouchers. That's the real issue. That's what we need to be talking about and attacking in North Carolina.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis. Alexandra, you're muted.
Awesome.
Okay,
Thank
go
you. Yes,
ahead.
I couldn't unmute. I was trying to unmute.
No worries. Go
And
for it.
appreciate it. Appreciate all the hosts of this forum. I echo my colleague Giovanni Lewis in talking about the need and talking about our kids. I think ultimately, as anybody who's in leadership, the question is, are you doing this out of love and care for all students? Or are you doing this for agendas, divisive tactics, or maybe misunderstandings? And, one of the things that I have really appreciated about being on the board and being able to interact with very, very experienced and caring folks is to understand that even among caring folks, misunderstandings, different ways of seeing things arise. And so it's conversations that are going to be the key to this. So I really appreciated naming what CRT is. I really also, just want to say that we are in the business and we are in the commitment of providing a sound and basic education for all students, for every single child. That is the priority. We want our kids to be prepared for the world. We want them to be the leaders. We want them to be able to access opportunities and careers that are going to be providing sustenance for their homes, but also for the broader community. And so if there are students that are hurting, if there are students that are perishing, if there are students that are not getting adequate resources, and we know that there are, all of society is going to be affected. The rise in crime rates, is indicative of pain. It's indicative of neglect. And the plea here is, if there is such a concern about critical race theory, what is the concern? And if it's a misunderstanding, how can we have the conversations about what it is? And also when it comes to education, how do we ensure that we address what really needs to be addressed in terms of like providing the funding and providing the support and nurture that every child needs. Every child to see themselves, in a school setting and increase their sense of belonging. That is one of the things that over and over we hear again and again. So many models and research kind of talk about how important it is for kids to feel that they are getting the best from every teacher. And there's so many factors that go into that. A teacher who is, struggling to make ends meet, who has 2 to 3 jobs and is having to come in and then has students that are not performing, that need extra support. Sometimes they give up their lunches. They give up their lunches to sit with kids who are struggling in so many subject matters. And so what is going to make our kids connect with the material better? I think the conversation is, how do we support students? How do we ensure that every child has space in it and in the learning? And also when it comes to the funding, if we are capping, especially English language learners, and this is at the state level, 10.6% of our funding, you give us money, right? But then you tell us that only 10.6% of that money can be used for English language learners. That is the real issue right there. And I think that is a CRT issue, because who are those students that are English language learners who need to be capped at a 10.6%? That's a CRT issue. While CRT is not being taught in Durham public schools, I say that there's a direct relation and correlation with the decisions that are happening with the funding. And also, we have exceptional children, right? They are the students who need the most support. And in Durham public schools, there's a cap, and that cap is 12.75%. It just got increased to 13%. Just a little bit of 12.75 going to 13%. Thank you for that. Thank you for increasing it. But I say that's not commensurate. It is not commensurate with the number of students that we have that need those supports. Children who rely on exceptional children's services, children who rely on extra supports, they don't need caps. They do not need the caps. You give us the money and we want to be able to use that money to support our students. That is a CRT issue. That is an issue that is definitely pitting, some students, putting them in predicaments of being neglected. and we do not want to neglect any child. I do not want any child neglected, and I do not want any child to perish. And Durham is mourning. Yes, we have issues. Yes, we are addressing school to prison pipelines. Yes, we are addressing the lack of connection that a lot of kids have with their teachers and educators and the school system in general, because that connection needs resources. We need folks to be able to have interpreters at every school that we don't have, right? We have interpreters that are serving 5, 6 schools at one time. And the number of kids that need those supports, the number of parents who call me every single day telling me they're navigating the system, they're using these digital platforms, there's a need for digital equity, those are CRT issues. So while I understand the concern is what is being taught, I want to point it at what is an issue that is directly related to folks being neglected, folks being left out of the equation. And I believe that critical race theory offers some insights into how we can ensure that everybody has access to a sound and basic education. Every child should have access to the best education that we can provide. And that is a North Carolina issue. Durham is within North Carolina. We are one piece of land. All our kids will be looking for jobs outside of Durham or in Durham. It's going to affect us all. So let's invest in our kids.
Thank you both. Powerful messages from both of you, especially thinking about in terms of something that really stuck with me, Alexandra, was when you said, like, who are we doing this for? Like, we need to be doing this out of the love of our students. Our children are the ones that are suffering at the end of the day when we continually attack things that, like you said, Giovanni, is a distraction, things that we shouldn't be distracted by. So definitely powerful statements there. Thank you so much for those statements. As we continue our discussion and start to zoom out to the state level, Michelle Burton, our next question is for you. We see these current attacks against curriculum as taking power and professionalism away from educators. What is the messaging at the state level from NCAE as it relates to countering this organized anti-education movement? Michelle, you're muted.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, yeah, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here because this is an issue that I'm personally invested in as a school library media coordinator, because 1, it deals with intellectual freedom, and 2, it deals with censorship issues. And when we start looking at those things, keeping information from people to learn the whole truth, the whole history, that should be concerning to us all. As president of the Durham Association of Educators, I am fully invested in the education and uplifting of all children and committed to the fight for racial and social justice. As a matter of fact, 2 of DAE's core beliefs is keeping students at the center of our work and our commitment to racial and social justice. And one of the things that I always like to remind audiences when I speak or present is that DAE is the local affiliate of the North Carolina Association of Educators, NCAE, and the National Education Association, the NEA, which is the largest labor union in our country with 3 million members. And it's led by a dynamic African-American woman named Becky Pringle. And there was a wonderful article about her in the New York Times this past Sunday, where she talks about her commitment for the right for equitable education, the fight for racial and social justice, and that the NEA, we stand for that totally. And one of the things that I want to share with you all, because we stand with our national affiliate and our state affiliate this past summer, at the NEA convention with over 8,000 delegates, we voted to allocate $700,000 into measures to eradicate institutional racism in our public schools. And we voted to allocate close to $60,000 to research conservative groups that are attacking educators who are doing the important work of teaching the true history of our country and teaching anti-racism in our schools. We felt as delegates, this was important because so many teachers and educators across the country are being attacked for doing this important work to educate our children. And because we have taken the stance, DAE, NCAE, NEA, to teach anti-racism, to teach the true history of our country, we are attacked and maligned by oppositional forces who want to destroy public education, not only in the state of North Carolina, but across the country. So I say all that to say, what is NCAE's response to this manufacturer crisis? NCAE message to its members is we must teach an honest curriculum that includes both the good and the bad parts of American history. And we also know that the opposition is using racial dog whistles to divide us and to attack public schools where the majority of our students of color attend. And also NCAE recognizes the challenges many school districts are facing from this manufacturer crisis of the CRT crisis, because they know that the demographics of public schools in North Carolina has changed drastically. Over the past 20 years, we know that over 50% of the students who attend North Carolina public schools are students of color. And so there's a big fear around that. So right now, NCAE is working closely with the NEA, our national organization, on research and messaging around CRT, because this issue is not only affecting North Carolina, but it's also facing a numerous number of states across the country. And so how do we work around this to make sure we're getting the message out? And how do we protect educators? And how do we teach the true history of our country? So.
Thank you so much, Ms. Albert. And yes, we need to be teaching our students the truth, the truth of our history, like you said, both the good and the bad. We need to be informing our students of what has happened and what can happen if these things go ignored. So yes, thank you so much for your comments. You're getting a lot of praise everyone's been getting a lot of praise in the chat. I've been looking over. Thank you so much for those of you utilizing the chat. Building on that, Representative Zach Hawkins, at the state level, can you explain the process of how House Bill 324, ensuring dignity and non-discrimination in schools, came to the floor? What did you make of that experience? And what does it mean that CRT was not explicitly named in the bill? And what do you make of the intentional vagueness of that? Kind of a couple of parts question.
Well, first, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, an important discussion. And thank you for allowing me to be here, and always proud to represent Durham and the Gold City. I think, the first thing I want to say is, all of the panelists that have spoken have given nothing but truth. And as a civil rights sort of leader said, that fear mongering and racism and baiting is like a Cadillac, right? There's always a new edition, always sort of a new model of it, and it's just evolved year over year over year. And that's sort of where we are with this whole debate around CRT. It is nothing but fear mongering, and politicians like our lieutenant governor and others who are jumping on this bandwagon, they're doing what they do best, sort of riling up the base, riling up the folks that will get distracted by pure fear tactics and nothing that is based on reality. And I think that the opening and what some others have said is really, really clear, that people, the average person, will tell you, I don't know what it is, but I don't like it. And that's just not acceptable. If you can't name it, if you can't describe it, then 9 times out of 10, it's a straw man. It's not real. And we do need to continue to say just that, but also be incredibly dedicated to allowing our kids to have a sound basic education in the state of North Carolina. As Javanya mentioned, that's something that we fought for, related to making sure that at least, and the courts even stepped in to ensure that $1.7 billion was given to pay for the first 2 years. And we have the money. I know that a lot of people went to Amazon and shopped over the pandemic, but that's not going to stop. North Carolina is going to continue to grow. People are going to continue to buy online. People are going to continue now that we're back at it to pay taxes and to buy goods. And we are continuously over the next few years to have the kind of money that we need to support public education. So do not let anybody tell you any different, that we cannot fund the sound basic education, which includes unraveling the history of the state of North Carolina and all that has gone in from Wilmington and the race riots to what's happening to indigenous folks and other people of color. They deserve to know. And the thing that I'm encouraged by is though we are having this conversation as adults, the generation that sits in front of us is done. And they will carry this thing forward because they want to know the unraveled truth of who we are. So back to the bill. So the bill 324 came to the legislature, basically from a national playbook. The only thing that they knew, of which I think has been mentioned before, is a way to sort of start the censorship and the constraints on public education and our teachers. Because I think the fear is that what happened 30 or 40 or sometimes even 50 years ago, they want you to think that happened a very long time ago, and not to realize that a lot of those people are still with us, still alive, who experienced it, and or who participated. And when history in the rearview mirror doesn't seem that far behind, it really makes you have to deal with it. And I think that as a part of the national playbook from conservatives, from Republicans, they are trying to get ahead of and play to a base, but also stop the real critical conversations that will happen because of the natural curiosity from students and all the ways that they get information. People just don't want discomfort. And as a former public educator, with discomfort comes education, right? And so the way that it was placed vaguely, the reason it was placed so vaguely is because we have a governor who they knew would veto the bill. And so though you saw in Texas and Georgia and some of the other states pretty sweeping reforms that outlined what you could and could not teach, what you could and could not say, in North Carolina, I truly believe that they understood that a lot of people were just not going to go for that, and they knew that the governor would veto. The reason he would veto is because he, as a product of public schools and the son of a public school teacher, understood the value of it. And the way that they watered it down was they said that the public school system and our curriculum should not make any one race or one gender or one people look bad or be looked down upon. That was sort of the gist of the way that they described the bill on the floor. And the pushback from folks on my side of the aisle and public school advocates was pretty clear, is that vagueness allows for interpretation by the beholder, right? And so if you're in a Durham public school where you may have more latitude to introduce your students to greater conversations and be able to sort of unlock history in a different way, it may be given as instruction to, or told that you can't do this in another school district. And so that flexibility, that vagueness was absolutely on purpose so that it could be interpreted as needed based on sort of where you were. And that's just not what education in North Carolina is supposed to be about. We want to make sure that if a kid is in Durham to Caldwell County or Elizabeth City, that they should all get a chance to understand how this great state has become what it's become. It's the most beautiful state in the country. But I think that it is under attack in a way that it never really has been before. And this is both happening in a overt way, as you see with the lieutenant governor and his crusade for this false campaign, but it's also happening slowly but surely with small attacks at a public school teacher. It's happening in small ways at school board meetings. It's happening, you see what I'm saying? And so I want to make sure that people understand that tonight's conversation, though we all are dispelling that CRT is not pushed into K through 12 curriculum, it is something that we have to make sure that the erosion of public education and what public school educators are able to do is not hurt for the long term, because that hurts the people that will get into public education, because they're not getting into it and being able to be who they thought they were going to be. They're not able to change the world if they have to be censored and have to think about everything they say, if they have to be recorded, if they have to not be fully engaged in the process of building citizens who can help make us better. And so that's the sort of the details, or the way that the bill came to be, the implications of it, the vagueness, and how we directly believe that that vagueness can be more harmful than anything that's prescripted in the bill. And so that's why I'm so glad that we were able to defeat it ultimately with the veto, and hopefully we can hold that veto when that time comes.
Thank you so much for that very honest and open response, especially about looking at that very intentional vagueness, right, and seeing it for what it was, and understanding that, yes, we need to do all we can to make sure that the continuation of our public school system and of our educators continues to grow, instead of feeling, like you said, feeling like educators can't be who they are in the classroom, and have to be weary of what they say and do at all times. So thank you so much for that. So last but certainly not least, before we get into some Q&A from the audience, I'd like to pose a question for the whole panel. So based on your individual roles, what do you all need the general public to know and do to keep us moving forward? So just a brief kind of, hope statement for us as we keep moving forward. Who would like to start us off?
Can I start off?
Go ahead.
I want to reiterate with what Ms. Lewis said earlier in terms of CRT not being taught in the public schools of North Carolina. I definitely don't teach it in my classroom. Do I teach a critical view of American history through the prism of race, class, gender, things of that nature? Yes, but that's American history. I mean, you can't teach American history without looking at these different social constructs that exist to classify us. That's just how it is. To the general public, I would say, educate yourself before you speak on things. Don't be sheeple, and support your local teachers. Learn who these candidates are who are running for your school boards. Learn their backgrounds, learn what their political positions are, and learn whether or not, as someone said earlier, are they pushing a certain type of political agenda, or do they really want to do what's transformational to help and assist all of our students, regardless of their zip code, their race, their gender, their religious affiliation, their ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll add this in, this is the history teacher in me. I'm a Leandro kid. I was a sophomore in high school when Leandro, I put it in the chat, didn't nobody say nothing. I put it in the chat. I was a sophomore in high school in Halifax County Schools when Leandro was originally filed in 1994, giving away my age, in Halifax County Superior Court. The board attorney for the Halifax County Board of Education, for the Halifax County Schools Board of Education, Larry Armstrong, who is still the board attorney, filed that lawsuit. I knew nothing about it. I'm pretty sure a lot of my peers in high school knew nothing about it. But getting back to what Ms. Alexandra said, the sound basic education, that stemmed from the 1868 North Carolina State Constitutional Convention, where Black men, some of whom were formerly enslaved, had the first opportunity ever in the history of this state to help craft the document that will govern it. And one of the things that they said is we need education. So talking about that sound basic education goes back to the Reconstruction era and those Black men working with those white men to craft a document that said education, despite it being separate, education is something that all the children of the state should be guaranteed to have. So let's really think about that in the context of this whole conversation around critical race theory. If I was to teach that in my classroom, would that be CRT? Or am I just teaching real American history, real state history? Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. Other sound bites of hope.
I can know, if that's all right. I need the general public to know that our schools are underfunded at the state level, which puts more burden on local funding. I need the general public to know about the Leandro court case over 20 years ago, where the state was found not to have met its legal obligations to provide a basic sound education for all students. There's a comprehensive plan that was submitted in 2021 that details policy changes and budgetary provisions over the 8-year period, as we talked about. That's what I want the public to know about. And as we center the students, I need people to appreciate and acknowledge what it will take to equitably educate all children in a culturally responsive way, where they see themselves in the education in an affirming way. People need to know the rights of our children, about the underfunding of public schools, and hold our General Assembly accountable to meeting the needs of all children, not to politicize education, but centering the children. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to add to what Vice Chair Lewis said about Leandro. And also I want to say, our schools are underfunded tremendously. And we really need parents to join in this fight to save and defend public education in our state. Like I said in my earlier presentation, this is a manufactured crisis because our opposition is really looking to privatize and to eliminate public education. And so we really need not only our parents, but the overall community to understand that. And so we can defend our public schools so we do not lose it to privatization. And they just use the CRT issue to put it's a wedge issue to get people to push their children out of the traditional public school system. And it's another way to starve our traditional public school system. So we really need parents to join in this fight and really educate themselves on how our schools are underfunded. And we gotta get Leandro. $1.7 billion is a lot of money, y'all. We could do so many great things with our kids if we had that money in our public schools, and our children who are marginalized would really get the education that they really deserve. So.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. And Michelle, that 1.7 billion is just the first 2 years of what should be given to ensure that every kid across the state of North Carolina gets what they deserve. And over an 8-year period, it's close to 6, almost 7 billion. And so again, we have the money. If we talk about things that the public should know, is that we have the money. There's just not the political will amongst the majority party to get it done. And if you believe deeply in education, like all of us, all the folks on this line, then you need to call someone who is in a district across the state and ask them to ask their legislator what their stance is on public education. Because, at the end of the day, North Carolina is going from number 9 to number 7 in US population over the next 2 decades. And that means there's a lot more people here. That's a lot more growth. That's a lot more opportunity for jobs. That's a lot more kids in our public school system. And so the cost, similar to what my colleagues have said, is if we don't invest now, what are we doing to our state? If we don't invest in public education, if we don't focus on it, if we don't look at the real challenges that are facing our kids, what is the long-term cost? And at the end of the day, you also have to realize for the general public that distractions like this do not help us feed and ensure that basic needs are met. And it doesn't ensure that teachers, highly qualified teachers, are in a classroom. It doesn't help a highly qualified principal be the head of a school. It doesn't help a kid get a job, right? And so when someone sort of starts talking about these issues of fallacy, things that are not rooted in reality, then those are the kinds of things that you have to combat it with. Very clear. Because the cost is too high for us to play these types of political games, because real children are at stake. And the state of North Carolina will not be all that it can be if we don't do what we're supposed to for public schools. And so I'm just glad to be here. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, and I'm just glad to be here with you. Thank you.
I'd like to share that the terminology trips up a lot of people, right? CRT and the point with which this forum started is that folks can't explain it. So how about we talk about the things that we can explain? Because academic terminology, jargon, provides a lot in terms of like being able to track these conversations. But if we are getting tripped up on the terminology, let's just talk about what it is that we want to do. We want to educate every child. And not just K through 12, we're actually setting them up for success, and there are already enough barriers. Josh Stein is out there, wrote a memo, and that memo effectively put a barrier for DACA students. And so the question is, how can a memo cause some students to pay out-of-state tuition when they're part of our communities and they're here? And so those are the things that I want to focus on. What are the barriers? And so the fleet is, if something like that can happen, how can we put a memo to revert that back? DACA students who have DACA are a part of our. Did I get muted?
Yeah, just for a moment.
Oh, okay. So DACA students are we talk about the lack of diversity in a lot of spaces, and we need language access. We need folks to speak the language. Bilingualism is something, we're in a global economy. We are a very diverse place with many languages, and it is the history of this country to embrace languages, embrace multiculturalism in all its ways. And it has been a strength for us to be able to speak as many languages. I would love to speak more languages, and I'm grateful that I got an education in Durham Public Schools through the International Baccalaureate program. I learned French, something I would never have been able to access while I was in school. I learned language and I read books in a different language, and it opened up my love of learning. Let's give that to our kids. Let's make sure that we center the diversity of our students, their interests. Let's center education. Let's make it what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be about inquiry, all the way going back to societies that were able to engage with content and be able to explore as many avenues to their learning. That's what we need. We need our kids connected to the higher and loftier goals of education. And so my thing is this: let's remove the barriers. If CRT, the term, trips you up, let's have the conversations about what we're seeing. We're seeing too many barriers for our kids. We're seeing barriers even when they leave our schools. Lack of access to higher education. A lot of students, myself included, had barriers, facing barriers to be able to access the higher level education that will actually give us the professionals that we need and add to our workforce, add to folks who contribute and continue to build. So let's remove those barriers. It starts from early childhood education. Let's talk about those issues. Let's talk about ways that we can really provide our kids what they need. And so, like I said, I'm not married to any academic term, but if it helps to have the conversation and we can talk about inequalities and we can talk about ways that we can position our students with the best resources so that they can be all that they want to be, I'm ready to have that conversation.
Thank you to all of you that posed those last statements here for us. Before we get into Q&A with the audience, I do want to speak to our audience directly. We will be doing about 15 minutes of a Q&A, so we have been keeping track of all your questions. We may not get to all of them, but we do want to hold space for a few of your questions. We're going to take about the next 15 minutes to answer those. Our panelists, be sure that you're as as explanatory as you can be, but try and keep it brief because we are running short on time. Also, after our Q&A, we will be in those breakout rooms with our current panelists as well as our other invited guests. So please stay with us, our audience, but know that we will be finishing a little later than we anticipated. So let's go ahead and go into our first Q&A from our audience. So how do we push back and accomplish the real goals of education? For example, teaching important, truthful, genuine content with love and care for our students. So this could possibly be for Ms. Valladares or Ms. Burton, maybe even Mr. Pierce. So how do we push back and accomplish the real goals of education? And anyone can answer.
I think it goes back to what we've already been saying tonight in terms of a quality investment in education and teacher preparation programs at universities or colleges in our state. And the one thing that I would stress, what has really helped me become a more competent educator, is professional development. But I'm talking about real PD, as we say, good professional development by competent instructors, and I'll put this in there because this group has meant a lot to me and has helped me a lot in terms of my content, teaching 8th grade social studies, which is North Carolina history and US history. Groups like Carolina K-12, Christy Henson Norris, working with her and working with that institution helped me become a better teacher, helped me in terms of how to introduce that content, that hard history in the classroom in a way that's equitable and in a way that's, I guess you could say, safe, and tries not to step on people's toes, tries not to insult kids or make them feel inferior or make them feel like they're being attacked. But at the same time, it's like, hey, this is coming from a place of love. I just want you to know what has happened. I want to show you what the evidence is. These are the historical facts. This is what the record is. You interpret it for yourself. You determine whether you think it's bad. You determine whether you think it's good. I'm going to give you the evidence. You make your interpretation. That group in particular has really helped me, and professional development in general. I think that is part of the Leandra plan. We really need to invest in quality PD for our educators so that they can tackle these subjects in the classroom in a way that is equitable and in a way that makes kids feel that they can not only embrace it, but they can engage the material and talk about it openly without feeling like they're going to be under any kind of scrutiny, not only from teachers, but from their peers.
Can I add to what Rodney has shared just now? Thank you for that, Rodney. And just from a board perspective, we have to create policy that supports and protects our educators and protects our students, to advocate for equity in education, to have these policies in place that supports the work that you're talking about. We also need to make sure we're supporting other boards and other communities that don't have the same type of community support that we have in Durham. We have to come outside of our silos and work with each other and create a climate and culture that is true to what we believe in North Carolina. So I just want to add that as well from the board perspective.
Thank you. So just to save on time, we're going to do about 1 to 2 responses here, but thank you for your genuine and open responses for that pushback. Our next question, so how is the attack on CRT connected to issues of voter suppression and the larger white supremacist movement, as Dr. Bullock suggested? This question's for anyone.
Well, yeah, I'll take that. Like I stated in my earlier response, if you look at the data of North Carolina public schools, and it's probably changed some this year, but I know I looked at it last year through the Department of Public Instruction, 52% of our kids who attend North Carolina public schools, about 1.5 million of them, are children of color. So you're having a significant demographic shift. So if you go back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, most of the students who attended public schools of North Carolina were white. And so because and I see it in, Durham public schools when I came back to teach in Durham from Wake County, it's a significant demographic shift. There's more diversity. And because people feel these, I guess, threats, you get this pushback, and you're seeing it in areas of voter suppression because you're seeing more people of color moving to the United States. People, Asians, African Americans, Latinos, what have you. And so you're going to get this backlash. One of the things that I've noticed, as I shared with you all earlier, I'm an elementary school librarian. I have seen the significant shift in children's literature over the past 20, 25 years, where children's literature, when I first started as a school librarian, it was mostly, let's just go ahead and say it was mostly white. And now you're seeing a lot of children's literature that's very diverse. And so, which is a great thing. And so you're getting this backlash of schools being funded because most of our children are children of color, people who are voting, people of color. And so it's all related to each other. But that means we have to fight for a fair, equitable society in all areas. So, yeah.
Thank you. Representative Zach Hawkins, I see that you unmuted. Were you going to respond to that one as well?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I think it's exactly right that the connection between the two is based on the fear mongering that I mentioned before, right? You rile the base up, you get people that are have a fear of the unknown and a fear of what they're being told, and the attacks on public education are what they're trying to dub as indoctrination, right? And then that, of course, erodes the number of people and the diversity that comes to our schools, right? It leaves students to not have the kinds of resources they need, because we know how the dollars flow in public education. And the people who perpetrate these things know those things, right? And I think that when you also have that they also understand that the more educated our population is, especially this generation, they're starting to unravel the fact that if these things have been kept away from me, right? And I think you're seeing a lot of, in this current generation, a lot of folks feel angry with public education, right? I wish I would have known this, right? And even people who are Gen Xers and Gen Yers, that they, just wish they would have known, but have realized that their public education has not been given to them in a fair and equitable way. When they do that and they want to go to the polls and exercise their right, they know that they understand who the friend and who the foe is. Does that make sense? And again, the opposition clearly understands, because there's a national playbook to outline those, right? And so these two topics have always intertwined throughout history, post-Reconstruction. And so it is something that is critical for us, again, to ensure that we're looking at pro-democracy type legislation and supporting that. Because again, the more people who are engaged, that's going to be a direct correlation to people who are engaged and going to the school board meetings and being vocal and being advocates for people who are pro-public education. So when we see things like the bills that Marcia and I and Natalie and I and all of us filed to have automatic voter registration, to make sure that we're allowing for voting drop-off places. We're making sure that we have extended time for people to go to the ballot box and get their absentee ballots after the voting day, election day. Making sure that you can do it online, right? And make it easier. All those things they see as connected, because again, the more people who are participating in democracy, the more people who are being educated in our public school system, it's a threat to keeping supremacy in place, right? The more people know, the less they are going to tolerate the people who are pushing our society in a state of a remedial state, because being in that remedial state is clear that again, everyone is not getting everything that they need, and I think the current public and this future generation are just not going to tolerate it. And so I'm so glad that you connected those two, because that's exactly how they intertwine with the legislation that you see. And that's exactly where it's all rooted from. Because again, the people who don't want us to progress deeply understand that. And if the public needs to know anything, none of this is accidental. None of this is one parent that got a little upset. All of this is absolutely strategic.
Yes, definitely have to look back at that strategy that they're employing against this idea, these ideas that we're trying to promote for our educators, for our schools, for our communities. Right, we need to look at that. Very organized and well funded. I think we have time for one more question. And again, I do apologize if we don't get to all of your questions, but please feel free to list them out, and we'll make sure that we get them to our local leaders here so we can get them answered at a later time. So from my work, this is from an audience member. From my work, I've seen the groups that create false narratives about CRT also are pushing anti-trans measures and attacking LGBTQ plus social emotional supports. We also know these attacks would disproportionately impact LGBTQ plus and BIPOC people. So where do we see movement together? But what more can we do to base build and erode the false narratives with truth? So a lot of things encompassed in that, but in the essence here, so what can we do to base build and erode the false narratives with truth in concerning these groups?
Yeah, I'll go quickly. It's completely based in exactly what I just mentioned in my last response. Mm-hmm. All these things are rooted in the same way, and we fight the exact same way, right? We make sure we get more people at the ballot box. We make sure we have strong, educated teachers, right? We put more into public education. We have more tolerant folks. We outline what it means to be tolerant and inclusive, and we try and make sure we put that into practice, because no matter what you push or talk about related to any marginalized group or part of society, the play on the other side is the exact same way to attack it. Does that make sense? And so not to oversimplify it, but it is absolutely a way for, we need to make sure that we're being vigilant first, but then secondly, making sure that anything that is related to pushing us back in a remedial state that we push back against. And the two efforts are voting, getting the right people in office, and then secondly, making sure that we again have the type of education system that allows for a vibrant community that is accepted and acceptable by all.
Yes, thank you.
I'll just jump in. Our work is about embracing, educating, empowering every student, right? We want them to innovate, to serve. We want them to reach their potential. And it is so important for us to provide the space that will welcome every child and let every child feel seen and heard and valued. We know the suicide rates, we know what the research shows. It really shows that there are specific students, there are specific groups, demographics that have higher incidences of mental health needs, are impacted differently based on lack of sense of belonging. We know that suicide rates among teenagers has been on the rise for years. So let's talk to the doctors. Let's talk to the folks that are tracking all of this. The field of epidemiology definitely offers a lot of insights into that. And so as educators, how do we ensure that we provide the kind of environment that welcomes every child, and that embraces every child, so we can educate every child, so we can empower every child, so that they can in turn innovate, they can serve, and they can lead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of those thoughtful questions from our audience and for such candid responses from our guests. Thank you so much for being on this panel here with us. We are going to move into the second part of our evening. I'd like to take a moment to relay some instructions first. So in just a moment, Sierra Gibbs, WeAre's amazing program administrator, will be placing us all into breakout rooms, which will be led by one of our invited guests, along with a WeAre staff member. Both of those folks will do quick reintroductions of themselves and get a conversation started with your respective groups. The two questions that you will use to guide your conversation are for our invited guests. What can you do in your role to recenter the conversation that is the larger movement about anti-democracy and white supremacy? And then for our audience, what ideas do you have for this leader elected official to do with their position of power? In a moment, one of my colleagues will drop those two questions in the chat for your reference. And one important note, you will see a box pop up asking if you would like to join the breakout room. If you are in need of translation services, please ignore that breakout room request and instead stay here in the main room. So in a moment, we should be ready to open up breakout rooms, if I can get a signal. Thank you, Dr. Calvin Bullock, for adding those questions. So we're just waiting on our breakout rooms to open. And you should see an invitation at this point. Again, if you are in need of translation services, please stay here in the main room. Otherwise, go ahead and join your groups. We'll see you back here for closing.
I'll try to give Representative Hawkins a few moments to get in his room before we get started.